Darkness fell across the storm-lashed courtyard of Storm's End, sweeping in from the narrow strand of coastline that separated the ancient fortress from Shipbreaker Bay. The wind howled, flinging brine and rain at the high, ancient walls that had withstood countless sieges and storms over centuries of Baratheon rule. Stone gargoyles perched upon ramparts, carved with the faces of ancient kings and dragons, seemed to twist in the flickering torchlight, their fanged mouths gaping as if to devour the storm itself. Night had come early, and with it arrived an otherworldly chill, an icy presence that took hold in every shadowed corner of the great keep. Servants, knights, and lords alike felt the unnatural cold nestle into the marrow of their bones, a creeping sense of dread that no hearth fire could dispel. Unbeknownst to them all, death walked across the waves that battered the rocky shores, silent as the gloom. Within the great hall, Lord Gendry Baratheon, once a common blacksmith's apprentice, now legitimized and named the head of his house by royal decree, tried to warm his hands by the crackling fire. His broad shoulders carried a weariness that was never taught at the forge. The weight of his newly bestowed responsibilities had already etched themselves onto his expression, and the oppressive sense of dread that had settled over Storm's End for the past week only deepened the lines on his brow. Advisors whispered of ill omens, of curious sightings along the coast. Ships of ice glimpsed on the horizon during the coldest hours of the night, strange swirling winds that moaned like tortured beasts, and shadows that moved against the flicker of moonlight. Gendry had thought it all superstition and rumor. Storm's End was known for its swirling tempests, after all, but the sense of foreboding in his heart could not be easily ignored. Something was amiss, and every man, woman, and child could feel it. A sudden gust rushed through the hall, slamming shut a tall oaken door and extinguishing half the torches in a single violent breath of wind. Noblemen and servants startled, stumbling away from the gust. Gendry's companion-at-arms, Ser Arlen Caron, spun around with a hand on his sword hilt. A swirl of dead leaves blew across the floor, carried in from the courtyard, and for a moment it seemed as though the leaves flickered with a ghostly blue luminescence. Several onlookers gasped. When the torches were relit, the leaves were only leaves, crumpled and brown, but the dying glow of them lingered in the minds of everyone present. Gendry tried to gather his composure. He was not a man of words. He had no formal training in speech. Yet something weighed on him to show confidence before his household. "Everyone, remain calm," he said, voice echoing. "It's only the storm." His tone, usually so strong, betrayed a tremor of doubt. Another gust rattled the tall windows, making the iron frames groan. The people glanced at one another uneasily, for if this were only the storm, it was a storm unlike any they had known. That night, as the hour of the wolf approached and most of Storm's End lay in fitful slumber, Gendry paced the battlements overlooking the Black Sea. The wind bit at his cheeks, and the cold was sharp enough to make his teeth chatter, but some compulsion forced him to keep watch. It was the same feeling he'd known while standing over a forge, waiting for the metal to shift from red to white hot, that precise moment of readiness, except now it was dread that heated his blood, not excitement. Gendry half expected to see an enemy fleet, sails dark in the night, but the horizon offered no sign of any standard or sigil. There was only the crash of waves upon the rocks and the sullen, roiling blackness of the sea. Yet the longer he gazed, the more convinced he became that he was not alone. The wind carried eerie sounds, like faint howls of wolves and shrieks of night creatures. Yet wolves did not roam this far south, and no gull made such a scream. Restless, he climbed down from the battlements and returned to the great hall, where a subdued gathering of knights and lords, still unsettled by the hour's unquiet, awaited him. The men were older than Gendry, more seasoned in war and politics, yet they looked at him as if he were Robert Baratheon himself resurrected, the man who had once instilled fierce loyalty in them all. That memory, of a father he'd never truly known, gnawed at him, fueling a resolve to protect these people, if he could. The doors burst open once more without warning, and a young page tumbled inside, panting wide-eyed, his face drained of color. Through ragged gasps, he spoke of a visitor at the gates. But it wasn't a man, he insisted. Couldn't be. It was something beyond comprehension, an icy presence that beckoned in the darkness, waiting just beyond the drawbridge. The page had seen only a glimpse, but the single flash of pale, dead flesh and glowing, inhuman eyes was enough to root him to the spot in terror. It had disappeared into the swirling snow, in the Stormlands in the early spring. That alone seemed an abomination. Gendry's first thought was that the page must be mad or mistaken. Yet he recalled the unnatural cold he felt on the battlements. Could it be possible? He exchanged uneasy glances with the knights, and wordlessly they prepared themselves for a confrontation. Half a dozen men armed themselves in haste. Gendry seized a warhammer, a massive, black iron head shaped after the one his father once wielded, and joined them. His heart pounded. If the stories were true, if the dead had truly risen in the far north, then no place in the Seven Kingdoms was safe from their approach. Rumors had trickled south like a malignant rumor for years, told in half-disbelieving whispers about an undead army that marched beyond the wall. Was it possible that the Night King himself had come to Storm's End? They reached the courtyard just as the gates rattled violently. A boom shook the wooden timbers. Snow whipped across the stones, dusting the cobblestones with a thin layer of white that quickly turned to slush in the rain. The men brandished torches, forming a defensive ring around the main portcullis. Gendry took position at the front, raising the warhammer across his chest. He felt the sweat freeze on his brow, his heart hammering. Another boom reverberated. The gate creaked but held firm. Then, without warning, a section of the wall above the gate froze over with a gleaming sheet of ice. Blue lines, like cracks in frozen glass, spread downward, creeping along the edges of the timber. Gasps rose from the men as the ice consumed the iron reinforcements, making them brittle and snapping them with a sharp crack. Everyone stood transfixed, fear rooting them in place. There was a final crash, and shards of icy wood exploded inward, sending splinters flying. Torchlight glimmered on the shattered fragments. Silence fell. Wind rushed through the gaping hole in the gate. Not even the guards dared to advance. And then a pale shape entered, the shape of a tall figure with a crown of curved horns of ice. He wore armor that looked fashioned from a strange, translucent material, edged in fractal designs that defied the eye. His skin was the hue of a corpse, and his eyes glowed with that eerie blue light the page had spoken of. Behind him, whites poured in, the dead men and women twisted in forms of slavering hatred, jaws slack and eyes empty except for that same frosty glow. They trailed in quietly, skeletons and rotted corpses clinging to ruined armor, swords rusted but deadly in their grasp. The knights shouted, the first pangs of real terror finally giving way to action, and they fell upon the whites with steel. Gendry roared a battle cry, the echo of it strangely muted by the snow that whirled in from behind the intruders. With every swing of his warhammer, he shattered bone and cleaved decaying flesh. But the whites pressed forward in an unbroken tide. Ser Arlen Caron thrust his long sword into the chest of a wight that wore tattered chainmail. The creature fell, but another replaced it, swinging an ancient axe. Gendry's men fought valiantly, but the courtyard filled with whites more swiftly than they could kill them. A freezing mist coated every stone. Hoarfrost appeared on the men's beards and eyelashes, and soon breathing itself became labored, each exhalation forming a trembling cloud of vapor that lingered unnaturally long. And still, at the edge of the courtyard, the tall figure in icy armor watched silently. The wind and snow swirled around him, fluttering his ragged cloak of black. It was the Night King. Though none among them had ever seen him before, they knew it by instinct, by the sheer aura of death and finality he radiated. Gendry caught sight of the tall figure from across the courtyard. He felt fear clamp his heart in a cold, relentless grip. Steel flashed in the torchlight. Men screamed. The ring of swords was drowned beneath an unearthly shriek that cut the air from somewhere behind Gendry. Ser Arlen, refusing to yield ground, bellowed, "For the Baratheons!" He brought his sword down in a clean arc, lopping off the head of a wight. But he had no time to savor the kill. Another emerged from the swirling snow, teeth bared, and latched onto him. He cried out. Gendry tried to intervene, but found 3 more of the undead blocking his path. He swung his warhammer, smashing 2 in quick succession, but the 3rd grabbed hold of the weapon's haft. The strength was unnatural, unholy. He wrestled it back, yanking the hammer free and caving in the thing's skull with a downward strike. By the time he looked up, the courtyard was in chaos. Bodies of both the living and the dead lay strewn about, and the moaning wights feasted on the living flesh of fallen defenders. Fear threatened to consume Gendry. Storm's End had never fallen to an army in living memory, yet now the dead roamed its courtyard. He caught sight of Ser Arlen again. The knight was pinned beneath a hulking, half-armored corpse, and although Gendry managed to pry it off with a furious blow, it was already too late. Arlen's eyes stared lifeless at the swirling storm. Gendry could do nothing but stagger back as more wights lunged. He realized then how desperate their plight truly was. No matter how many wights they killed, the courtyard kept filling, as if the dead poured in through every crack in the walls. That was impossible, he thought, but the storm was unnatural, conjured by some foul sorcery that twisted reality itself. With no other choice, Gendry bellowed a retreat. Those who still lived fled deeper into the keep, trying to bar doors and windows, but the relentless cold followed them. Sheets of ice formed on iron hinges, fracturing them. The stone floors turned slick with frost. Torches and braziers hissed and died as if starved of oxygen. No part of the great fortress, built to withstand the mightiest storms, seemed able to stand against this glacial invasion. Women, children, and the old huddled in a hidden cellar, but terror rolled through the corridors as the moans and wails of dying men echoed from above. Sporadic clashes of steel echoed from the upper levels as pockets of resistance continued to fight. Gendry and a small group of knights made their stand by the great hall's wide entry, determined to protect those who sought refuge within. Doors crashed open and shut, and in the flickering gloom, the first wight that emerged was a face Gendry recognized. Ser Arlen, eyes now glowing that hateful blue, jaw slack and limbs moving with a jerkiness that betrayed the body's ruin. Gendry faltered, the shock of seeing his friend so hideously transformed stealing the breath from his lungs. The newly risen wight lurched forward, sword raised in a twisted reflection of his old skill. Tears and rage filled Gendry's eyes. He forced himself to raise his warhammer. The first blow destroyed the sword hand, the second blow ended the head. A final hiss escaped the wight's parted lips, and then it lay still. But that was only one. More of the dead streamed in, and somewhere among them stood figures in Baratheon livery, reanimated and robbed of will, forced to serve a new, dreadful master. In that moment, Gendry realized that House Baratheon's proud legacy was being consumed. The history of defiance and loyalty, the centuries of unbroken control of the Stormlands, crumbled beneath the unstoppable tide of the undead. Another surge of wights overcame the defenders. Gendry swung until his arms ached, his shoulders screaming with each impact. Yet the undead were numerous beyond belief. He felt a pang in his side as a rusted blade found its way beneath his mail. Pain flared, blood trickled, his vision blurred, and he coughed, trying to maintain his footing. The men around him fell, screaming, only to be raised again moments later in that cruel, silent transformation. The unthinkable was happening. Storm's End was being overrun by the cold might of the Night King. At last, the thick oak doors of the great hall were shattered. The next moments passed in a blur. Gendry was forced to retreat, half dragging himself and half propelled by the press of undead, until he tumbled down a dim corridor leading to the castle's lower levels. It was just wide enough for 2 men abreast. He used that to his advantage, bracing himself as he swung, preventing the wights from swarming around him. But they continued to come, a ceaseless wave. Exhaustion made his limbs feel like lead. For every step he took backward, the dead advanced apace. Icy fog poured in behind them, extinguishing every torch upon the walls. Soon the corridor was lit only by the hellish glow of the undead eyes and the faint moonlight that seeped through arrow slits, refracted by swirling snow. Then, as if to mock him, the wights abruptly parted. forming a ragged channel down the corridor. At the far end, the tall figure appeared. The Night King's terrible gaze swept over Gendry, pinning him in place. Gendry's heart thundered. He could hear the faint pop and crackle of ice forming on the walls, creeping closer like a living thing. The warhammer felt impossibly heavy in his hands. Snow swirled around the Night King, creating an aura of shifting shadows around his figure. The corridor's silence pressed in on Gendry's ears until his own heartbeat was deafening. He lifted the hammer, not out of bravery, but because he knew no other way to face a threat. The Night King took a step forward, slow, deliberate, the swirl of frost parting for him. Gendry inhaled, preparing to charge. But just as he shifted his feet, the world lurched in a flash of motion. The Night King darted forward with inhuman speed. Ice-coated gauntlets clamped around Gendry's warhammer. The crash of metal on ice echoed like thunder in the narrow space. Gendry felt a cold so intense that it burned. It traveled up the hammer's haft, freezing his hands where they clutched the weapon. He tried to cry out, but no sound came. The force behind the Night King's grip was monstrous. Gendry's knees buckled. His arms trembled. He struggled, but the warhammer was wrenched from his hands. He stumbled back, gasping in pain as ice covered his fingers, turning them bluish-white in the gloom. Something inside him snapped with realization. He was no match for this being. The Night King regarded him, head cocked in a silent, terrible curiosity. In that moment, Gendry saw the faint reflection of his own wide, fearful eyes in the creature's vacant gaze. His entire body felt numb. He tried to back away, but an icy hand shot out, seizing him by the neck. The cold raced through his veins, an agonizing freeze that settled around his heart. Gendry tried to swing a fist, but his movement was clumsy and slow, as if he'd been submerged in frozen water. The Night King's expression did not change. Slowly, inexorably, the grip tightened. A faint memory flickered in Gendry's mind. The forging of steel, the heat of the coals, the hammer's ring. Robert Baratheon's face, his father's face, formed in his mind's eye, not as he truly remembered him, but as he imagined him, a giant of a man wielding a massive warhammer, unstoppable on the battlefield. Gendry had spent years imagining living up to that legacy, forging his own path with pride and will. Now, all that was slipping away in the silent corridor of a dying castle. He felt his breath catch, his vision grow dim, and as unconsciousness beckoned, a thought formed. Storm's End had fallen, and so had House Baratheon. When Gendry's eyes opened again, he awoke to a vast emptiness. He was lying in the courtyard, but it had been transformed into a realm of ice and shadows. The once grand keep of Storm's End was coated in hoarfrost. Icicles dripped from every parapet, and the bodies, both living and dead, were strewn about in silent testament to the massacre. A pale moon hovered above, its light diffused by black clouds. The snow had ceased, replaced by an unsettling stillness. Something told Gendry that time had passed, though he could not say how much. He tried to rise, but his body did not respond in the way he expected. A prickling numbness crawled across his limbs, and the slightest shift caused a painful surge of cold. He looked down to see pale skin, reminiscent of the color of dead flesh. Panic flared in his chest, but it was distant, as if behind a veil. He noticed now that around him, a few figures stood unnaturally still. They wore the torn livery of the Baratheon stag, but their eyes glowed with that dreadful blue light. He feared to look at his own hands. Slowly, he lifted them. His fingers were indeed pale, and though he tried to recall warmth, it felt like a distant dream. In that moment, he understood the horror of it. He had been turned. The Night King had claimed him. A strangled cry escaped his throat, though it sounded more like a hiss. He tried to summon words, to speak, but all that came was a breath of cold wind. Gendry's soul raged within, but the hold the Night King exerted was absolute. He struggled to move again, testing the boundaries of his new existence, and found that he could stand, albeit in a manner stiff and disjointed. Every muscle felt taut, every joint rusted. It was as though his own body was not truly his anymore, but a puppet dancing on invisible strings. And yet, he retained some sense of self, at least for the moment. He possessed the hideous clarity to recognize his predicament, but no means to resist it. All around, the newly turned members of House Baratheon and their retainers rose. The swirling snow in the courtyard illuminated their pale faces, some half-eaten or riddled with sword wounds, others relatively intact but drained of life, now enslaved. Gendry recognized the once familiar faces, men he had eaten with, trained with, men who had pledged their loyalty to him. They stood side by side, arranged in silent ranks. Their eyes glowed in silent unison. The truth pressed upon him with terrifying clarity. House Baratheon was no more. They belonged to the Night King now. The figure in icy armor appeared at the top of the courtyard steps. He gazed down upon his new minions, the conqueror of Storm's End. There was no triumph in those cold eyes, only a vast emptiness. He raised one hand, as if beckoning, and in a ripple of movement, the turned Baratheons responded, lifting their swords or standing at attention in perfect unison. Gendry found that he, too, could not resist. His arms moved as commanded, the final vestiges of his free will overshadowed by an otherworldly compulsion. Somewhere, deep in his mind, he screamed in denial, but no sound emerged. He was but a single drop in a frozen sea of the dead. Word of Storm's End's fall spread slowly and disjointedly through the Stormlands. A handful of survivors, those who had fled before the main assault, or who had been sent away on errands, returned to find their ancestral seat under a deathly shroud, its gates torn asunder and its walls glistening with frost in the dawn light. They saw whites patrolling the battlements, silent silhouettes outlined against the dim sky. Terrified, the scouts and small folk fled, carrying horrifying tales to the nearest towns, only to discover that the terror had preceded them, creeping along the storm-lashed roads like a plague. Small holdfasts began to report sightings of pale warriors at night, hearing the cold shrieks of the undead in the distant hills. It was as though a malignant winter was blossoming across the Stormlands, unstoppable and suffocating. Yet, for a time, those who had not seen the devastation refused to believe it. Farther inland, the lords who had pledged allegiance to House Baratheon thought it impossible that Storm's End, impregnable fortress that had withstood countless sieges, could fall in a single night. Messengers brought conflicting reports, some claiming an army of whites had been conjured by the Red Woman's leftover sorceries, others whispering that the Targaryen's dragons had turned traitor. More fanciful rumors spoke of an unspeakable entity from beyond the wall, an ancient foe that aimed to claim the Seven Kingdoms for itself. Only those few who had glimpsed the Night King firsthand realized that the threat was all too real. Lord Mathis Rowan, a minor bannerman who held a small keep near Rain House, received one such survivor who arrived raving of Storm's End's downfall. The poor wretch had half-frozen limbs and babbled about a terrible white shadow leading dead men through the gates. Lord Rowan had the man treated for frostbite, an odd condition in the southern Stormlands at this time of year, and listened gravely to his ramblings. By the time the old lord dispatched riders to learn the truth, it was too late. The undead had already seized the roads. None of the riders returned. Closer to King's Landing, word reached the capital in breathless scraps. The new monarchy, whether under Queen Daenerys Targaryen, King Bran Stark, or another ruler, depending on one's chosen hypothetical timeline, soon realized that an unimaginable threat had broken past the north. For the Night King to have come so far south, to stand at the threshold of the Stormlands, meant that the old wars and rivalries among living houses ceased to matter. A new war, the only war that truly mattered, had begun in earnest. But House Baratheon was lost, or so it seemed. No ravens came from Storm's End bearing pleas for aid. No envoys arrived at the Red Keep. The old Baratheon banner of the crowned stag on gold was left in tatters atop the fortress. Each day, the intangible chill of death moved further inland. Stray farmsteads were discovered empty, with doors ripped off and frost clinging to the threshold. Tracks of shambling footprints led away into the wilderness. Those refugees who escaped brought stories of a tall figure in ice armor, a demon with eyes the color of a winter's moon. Behind him marched the silent ranks of the newly turned lords and knights of House Baratheon. They were commanded with a single gesture. The stories claimed that once turned, they retained some knowledge of warfare and strategy, a terrifying combination of undead resilience and mortal cunning. Whispers reached King's Landing that Gendry Baratheon was among them, the blacksmith turned lord, now a white general leading the armies of the dead. Rumors claimed he still carried a massive warhammer of black iron, the metal now sheathed in ice. Others said he fought with no weapon at all, letting the frost that had consumed him tear through living flesh with a single touch. These stories varied, but they all agreed on one crucial point. The Baratheons, or what remained of them, served at the Night King's right hand. Those few lords who dared to rally their forces and attempt to retake Storm's End found themselves woefully outmatched. A newly mustered host of 5,000 men, led by a coalition of minor Stormlander houses, marched on Storm's End from the east. They hoped the fortress might be reclaimed swiftly, believing that the undead had moved on. When they arrived, Storm's End sat in bleak silence, the walls seemingly deserted. Snow fell in thick flakes, though the time of year made such weather a grim omen indeed. The men advanced cautiously, scaling the outer walls with ropes and ladders, only to discover that the Night King had set a trap. In the courtyard they found not a soul. Then, as the wind shifted, the gates slammed behind them, sealed by an explosion of ice that no mortal tool could break. The dead emerged from the keep's interior, pouring out of dark corridors, led by the tall figure with eyes of blue. Caught within the courtyard, the living had nowhere to run. Screams echoed off the frozen walls. The living men fought desperately. Steel rang on steel, but every fallen soldier became a new wight moments later. Archers on the battlements discovered that the wights had scaled the walls behind them, silent as spiders. A few men, in utter desperation, leapt to their deaths onto the jagged rocks below rather than be turned. By dawn, the courtyard was empty again, save for the new ranks of the dead, motionless in the falling snow. Another house annihilated, more souls added to the Night King's host. One by one, the Stormlands buckled under the inexorable advance. Villages emptied or were slaughtered. Local lords, reluctant to believe the threat, found themselves quickly overwhelmed. Those who tried to muster at harvest festivals or gather men in taverns discovered that winter's pall had already stolen over their lands, and the frightened small folk deserted in droves, fleeing west or north, hoping to find shelter in other regions of the Seven Kingdoms. But with each passing day, the undead army grew larger, and the cold grew deeper. In the meantime, the great lords of Westeros took counsel with one another, forced to set aside old grudges. Those still loyal to the crown scrambled to prepare defenses. Across the Blackwater Bay, the Crownlands put their garrisons on high alert. North in the Reach, the Tyrells, if they yet lived or had surviving kin, or other prominent lords braced themselves for a wave of refugees. Still, many had not personally witnessed the horror and wondered if the rumors were exaggerated. After all, how could the cold of the far north cross the entire continent in mere days or weeks? Far to the north, word reached the Starks, who had once faced the Night King and his army. They could ill afford to send a large force, still rebuilding from their own losses. Yet they knew better than most that ignoring the undead threat would be the doom of the realm. Messengers and ravens flew, lines of communication opened with the Targaryens, if Daenerys' forces were still present in Westeros or if Jon Snow led what remained of the northern armies. A sense of uneasy urgency settled upon the Seven Kingdoms, as if the land itself recognized a rising storm that transcended mortal wars. The question was not whether to act, but how, and whether it was already too late. Within Storm's End, the Night King established a silent dominion, a seat of frozen power from which to spread the long night. The fortress that had once stood defiantly against storms and invaders was now subdued beneath the hush of eternal winter. The great hall stood in eerie silence, its tapestries torn and caked in frost, the once proud banners of the crowned stag torn asunder. Icicles dripped from the rafters like stalactites in a forlorn cave. The only sound was the distant groan of ice shifting along the walls and the occasional clank of a wight's armor as it shifted in place. In the courtyard, New additions to the Night King's army were made almost daily, the previously fallen men from failed assaults or wandering stragglers captured on the roads. Each turned soldier stood motionless among the ranks, waiting for a silent command. At the head of these was Gendry. Whether by design or some sinister curiosity, the Night King had allowed Gendry to retain more of his martial skill, possibly a trace of memory. Shackled by ice, Gendry's mind floated in a black current, conscious but powerless. Sometimes, he thought he glimpsed other faces from his past among the ranks, but each recognition brought only a deeper pang of despair, smothered beneath the relentless command that forced him to obey. He became aware of a macabre routine, if it could be called that, repeating each day. The Night King's lieutenants, tall, pale figures akin to him, though less fearsome, prowled the corridors. They inspected the newly turned, ensuring no spark of defiance lingered. They roamed through Storm's End as though it were an ancient ruin for them to claim. Occasionally they would approach Gendry, eyeing him with something like interest but never speaking. Their mouths remained mute, as if language had been abandoned for a more primal means of domination. One day, in the uncertain light of dusk, Gendry found himself ordered to the old forge where he had once hammered steel as a boy. Now the forge lay cold. The coals were long dead, the anvil slick with ice. Tools sat frozen to the workbench. Nothing in this place remained alive. With jarring slowness, Gendry was compelled to pick up a hammer. But this hammer was not the robust blacksmith's tool he knew. It was covered in a layer of shimmering frost, the handle etched with swirling runes of ice. Beside him, half a dozen wights, former blacksmiths or farriers perhaps, stood silently awaiting direction. The Night King watched from the shadows of the archway. Though Gendry could not see his face clearly, he sensed that the ancient terror meant for him to craft something. A new breed of weapon or armor, an extension of the dreadful war machine that the Night King was building in the Stormlands. Within Gendry's imprisoned mind, a tiny spark of defiance remained. He remembered forging arrowheads for the war against the dead years ago. He remembered how dragon glass could be deadly to White Walkers. But now, with each swing of the ice-etched hammer, he felt the cold creeping deeper into his soul, a silent chain that forced him to create. The tools made no normal ring upon the metal, for the anvil itself was compromised by the frost. The iron he hammered glowed not red, but a faint bluish-white. The wights assisted him, placing lumps of cold metal from the ruins of Baratheon swords and armor into a bizarre contraption that glowed with malevolent enchantment. Slowly, piece by piece, they fashioned new armaments for the undead. Swords that glimmered with frost, spears that crackled with frigid energy. The forging process felt like an abomination of everything Gendry had once loved about his craft. Yet he could not stop. The Night King silently observed, and Gendry labored, a slave to an unholy will. In the following weeks, the Stormlands continued to descend into a deepening winter. Rivers froze over, a phenomenon never before seen in that region. Crops withered in the fields. Livestock died or vanished. Packs of wights roamed the roads, commanded by the newly turned Baratheon knights who had once been proud horsemen. Occasionally, a group of living warriors arrived at the outskirts of Storm's End, hoping to find survivors to rescue, only to join the legions of the dead. The entire region became a ghostly wasteland, where the living dared not wander lest they be taken by the cold. Beyond, the lords of Westeros scrambled to form a plan. A council was held in King's Landing, or some neutral location, where those who understood the true scale of the threat tried to rally the realm. Arguments erupted. Some believed that only dragonfire could stop the undead, that Daenerys's remaining dragons or whichever Targaryen heir might remain must be brought south. Others insisted on forging alliances with the Iron Islands, the Vale, Dorne, any who could muster a united front. But the question loomed: how to strike at the Night King in Storm's End when the fortress was so entrenched and the legion of the dead so vast? Amid these debates, news arrived of the undead host marching northward from Storm's End, capturing smaller keeps and forging a path towards the Rose Road. Refugees spread out across the Reach and Crownlands. Tensions rose. If the Night King broke out of the Stormlands in force, He could threaten King's Landing, Highgarden, and every land in between. Memories of the Great War in the north resurfaced in the older knights who had faced whites at Winterfell. The threat was real. The great houses had no choice but to act. Still, time was not on their side. Each day delayed was another day the undead ranks swelled. Some lords proposed that a small, elite force sneak into Storm's End to strike directly at the Night King, hoping that destroying him would disable all whites, including the turned Baratheons. Others saw such a plan as folly, believing that the fortress was a death trap brimming with the Night King's mightiest guardians. Eventually, out of necessity, they decided on a two-pronged strategy. A main army would hold strategic points in the Stormlands to slow the undead advance, while a specialized company led by the realm's greatest warriors would attempt to infiltrate Storm's End. If they succeeded in destroying the Night King, the undead threat might be ended with a single stroke. If they failed, there might not be a Westeros left to save. At dawn on a day so cold the sky seemed to crack, a vast host of combined Crownlanders, Reachmen, and Dornish spearmen massed near Summerhall, preparing to move eastward into the Stormlands. The golden sun of Dorne and the rose of Highgarden flew side by side with the dragon of Targaryen, if that house still stood, or the banners of whichever monarch held power. The men clutched their cloaks around them, stamping their feet against the unaccustomed chill. Frost clung to their eyelashes and beards. Even the knights who had faced winters in the north remarked on the unnatural cold. Overhead, a single dragon, if Daenerys or another Targaryen heir was present, circled, blotting out the sun momentarily with its leathery wings. The men took this as a sign of hope. If Dragonfire could burn away whites in the north, perhaps it could do so here as well. But many among them whispered that the Night King had bested dragons before, or so the stories from the last war claimed. The first clashes occurred in the wooded valleys between Summerhall and Storm's End. Patrols of undead cavalry, men in Baratheon livery, their horses half-decayed but fueled by sorcery, ambushed scouts. The living began to learn how cunning the whites could be under the direction of turned knights who remembered the terrain. Skirmishes ended in brutal casualties for both sides. However, the living discovered that dragonglass weapons still worked, and fire arrows proved effective against the frozen flesh. Yet for every victory, more men fell, only to be raised if their bodies were not immediately burned. As the main host pushed deeper into the Stormlands, they encountered horrors that defied imagining. Entire hamlets lay frozen under sheets of clear ice, as if winter had snatched them in a single breath, leaving families trapped in their final moments of terror. The living found no living foes there, only the dead, who erupted from behind snowdrifts or burst forth from shuttered houses. The road became slick with the blood of men and whites alike. By the time they reached within sight of Storm's End, the army was considerably smaller, morale drained by the incessant cold and the relentless ambushes. Storm's End appeared ahead, half-shrouded in a thick bank of fog, its once impressive towers gleaming with white frost under the subdued light. The main host made camp in a shallow valley, using what remained of the day to fortify. They dug trenches, lit great pyres to keep warm, and posted archers with dragonglass arrows around the perimeter. Under the command of their generals, they prepared to siege an already fallen fortress, a paradoxical and dreadful task. The men tried to reassure themselves that the infiltration team, led by whatever heroes or famed knights had come, might succeed in slipping through side passages or the old postern gate. They had to believe in some chance of victory, else all was lost. Night descended with a savage swiftness, as if the very cosmos conspired with the Night King. The temperature plunged, and an unearthly wind keened across the plain. Snow began to fall, thick and heavy, accumulating in drifts around the camp. Watchfires sputtered, threatened by gusts laced with ice crystals. The living forces clung to their fires, drawing cloaks tighter, hearts pounding as they awaited the inevitable. A hush fell over the camp, broken only by muttered prayers and the restless shuffling of horses. In the middle of the blackness before dawn, the whites attacked. They came out of the swirling snow in terrifying silence, thousands strong. At their head rode tall figures on undead horses, figures in Baratheon plate, tinted with frost, eyes glowing. Leading the charge was a man brandishing a massive warhammer of black steel rimmed with ice. Gendry Baratheon. His once-living features were contorted by the pale hue of undeath, but in his eyes flared that accursed blue. The men in the living army who recognized him felt fresh horror seize them. The rumor was true. House Baratheon's new scion was the vanguard of the Night King's legion. The living rushed to form shield walls. Pikes bristled. Archers loosed a volley of dragonglass-tipped arrows. A few wights fell, arrow shafts protruding from bone and decaying flesh, but the line kept coming. The cavalry slammed into the living ranks, an impact that rang with shouts and the clangor of weapons. Swords met spears, warhammers crashed into shields. Gendry's hammer sent men flying, their breastplates dented inwards, the breath and life crushed from their bodies. Dragonglass spears glanced off the icy armor that had been forged in Storm's End's desecrated smithy. Even so, some wights fell as the living fought back with desperate courage. Torches and wildfire bombs ignited clusters of undead. The battlefield flared with green, unnatural light. Screams resonated through the gloom. Somewhere amidst the chaos, a horn sounded, and a roar split the night. A dragon, if still part of the allied forces, swooped down, flames spewing from its jaws in a torrent of orange and red. The conflagration engulfed dozens of wights, turning them instantly to ash, their screams lost in the inferno. Hope surged among the living, but the Night King himself, perched atop the highest wall of Storm's End, lifted a single hand. From that vantage, he could see the entire battlefield. His eyes glowed fiercely. The storm above intensified. Black clouds swirled, laced with lightning. A bolt of icy power surged downward, striking the dragon mid-flight. The beast bellowed in pain, its wing encased in crystalline frost. It spiraled downward, smashing into the battlefield with a thunderous crash, crushing living and dead alike beneath its bulk. The living gasped at the sight. Even the might of dragons was not assured against such power. All around, men fought and died, their blood steaming in the cold air. Pockets of the living force managed to rally, forming defensive circles around lords or key banners, but it was apparent that they were heavily outnumbered. The only hope lay in the infiltration team. If they could reach the Night King and strike him down, maybe the tide would turn. So, in the midst of the chaos, a small band of the realm's finest warriors slipped away from the main fray, circling the fortress to find a hidden entrance said to lead into the dungeons. Whether it was an old smuggler's tunnel or a drainage culvert, they used every ounce of stealth to evade the wights guarding the perimeter. The labyrinth beneath Storm's End was a twisting, claustrophobic place of dripping tunnels and old storerooms. Now it was encased in patches of ice. The infiltration team, their torches subdued, ventured carefully, mindful of every scraping footstep. Echoes might carry. Occasionally, they passed the remains of Baratheon servants who had tried to flee weeks earlier, their bodies frozen in corners or collapsed behind crates. The infiltration team pressed onward, hearts pounding with each step. At length, they emerged into the lower levels of the castle, navigating dark halls where the stone was slick with frost. They encountered wights patrolling in small groups, but dispatching them with dragonglass daggers and muffled strikes. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the cold became, seeping into their bones. Some swore they heard whispers on the edge of hearing, faint moans carried by the wind that slithered through the corridors. They passed the old smithy, glimpsing for themselves the twisted forges where Gendry had labored. Icy weapons stood arranged along racks, each piece glimmering with a lethal allure. They dared not tarry. Eventually, after many tense moments, they neared the Great Hall. Through a tall archway rimed with ice, they could see a swirling vortex of cold in the center of the floor. The Night King stood there, still as a statue, gazing at a strange ritual, blue flames dancing across the flagstones, licking up the columns. A few white walkers, his lieutenants, encircled him. The infiltration team exchanged grim nods. This was their chance, if any. They removed the jars of wildfire they carried, prepared their dragonglass weapons, and prepared to rush in. Death was certain for many, But if even one of them could land a telling blow, the realm might be saved. They burst into the hall with a battle cry. The White Walkers turned instantly, raising blades of crystalline ice. The infiltration team clashed with them, steel and dragonglass meeting frigid shards that screamed upon impact. One of the men hurled a jar of wildfire toward the swirling vortex, aiming to disrupt the Night King. But with a flick of his wrist, the Night King unleashed a burst of icy wind, freezing the jar midair before it shattered harmlessly on the floor. Another warrior, brandishing a Valyrian steel blade, charged the Night King directly. Sparks flew as the ancient metal clashed with the Night King's staff, but the foe was impossibly strong, sending the attacker sprawling. The infiltration team fought valiantly, but the power arrayed against them was immense, and from behind came the tramp of wights converging on the hall. In the frenzy, one infiltrator managed to slip behind a column, carefully lighting a small cask of wildfire. He hurled it at the dais near the Night King's feet. This time, the Night King's immediate attention was elsewhere, grappling with a knight who had pressed the advantage of a Valyrian steel sword. The cask exploded, sending green flames roaring across the dais. The Night King snarled silently, battered by the shockwave. For a fleeting instant, he staggered, and cracks of black frost appeared on his armor. Sensing the moment, the knight lunged, burying the Valyrian steel blade into the Night King's side. A shrill, piercing wail ripped through the hall. All movement ceased. The knight twisted the blade. Could this be the end? But the Night King's eyes blazed brighter. He seized the knight by the throat. The Valyrian steel remained lodged, yet he did not fall. Instead, shards of ice began to crawl along the sword, covering it, fracturing it. The knight stared in horror as the prized blade splintered under the unnatural cold. With a final, dismissive motion, the Night King tossed the knight aside. The man's body slammed against a column with a sickening crack. The infiltration team realized with dread that their last gambit had failed. The Night King had grown stronger since the battles in the north, or the conditions here, steeped in winter's sorcery, fortified him beyond the old vulnerabilities. Their chance of victory vanished. One by one, they fell to the White Walkers or the wights pouring into the hall. As dawn broke on the plains outside Storm's End, the living army found itself in shambles. Corpses littered the snowy fields, their faces twisted in frozen agony. The undead reigned supreme, led by the turned Baratheons whose knowledge of the land and tactics made them lethally efficient. Those who survived fell back in disorganized retreat, harried by wights at every step. Some tried to gather around the wounded dragon, if it still lived, hoping to protect it from being turned, but the freezing storm battered them mercilessly. The night had been lost, and with it, the Stormlands were firmly in the Night King's grip. Within the fortress, the Night King stood triumphant in the Great Hall. At his feet lay the bodies of the infiltration team, soon to be razed or destroyed as he saw fit. Icy wind whirled around him, a ghostly reflection of his dark power. The swirling flames of sorcery on the floor had dissipated, replaced by a sheen of new frost. With a final gesture, he summoned Gendry and the remaining turned Baratheon knights. They appeared, stoic, silent, bowing before their dread master. The memory of House Baratheon's proud defiance had been extinguished, replaced by a cold servitude that answered only to the Night King. Gendry, deep within his undead shell, felt the faint embers of his own will flicker, but they were lost amidst a blizzard of the Night King's command. This was his new reality, and he could do nothing but obey. The courtyard, once so full of life, was now a realm of ghosts. No human warmth or laughter echoed off the walls. No hearth glowed. No ravens soared overhead to carry messages of defiance. A hush blanketed the keep. If there was any consolation, it was that the once stormy skies above Storm's End were now perpetually filled with snow, a frozen scorn that had long been the fortress's defining element. But now, rather than swirl in a living tempest, the wind carried only the stench of death and the promise of an endless winter. The crowned stag of House Baratheon, a sigil of power and rebellion, had become a silent sentinel of the grave. In the days that followed, the Night King continued his march north and west, using Storm's End as a stronghold to launch forays into the Reach and the Crownlands. Reinforcements from the living trickled in, but never enough to match the dead. Even the Targaryen dragons, if any remained, could not alone stem the tide. The undead were cunning, always seeking new ways to outmaneuver the living. The knowledge of strategy that the turned lords and knights brought to their new master made the Legion a foe unlike any the realm had ever seen. Reports emerged of some White Walker or White that looked eerily like Gendry leading a strike against certain targets, supply lines, farmland, or lesser holdfasts. Survivors claimed the figure carried a great warhammer that shimmered with frost, and that he fought with terrible ferocity. Some believed that, beneath the cold thrall, Gendry's skill at arms had been honed to an even deadlier edge. Others whispered that maybe Gendry's soul still lived inside, that he had not struck lethal blows unless forced. But the dead left few survivors to confirm such rumors. Despair settled upon the southern kingdoms. The unstoppable winter advanced, defying the logic of seasons. Storm's End, a bastion once famed for withstanding the darkest storms of the sea, had become the nucleus of an unimaginable gloom. Scouts who neared the fortress spoke of hearing faint moans echoing from the dungeons, where newly turned whites awaited instructions. Some saw the silhouette of the Night King himself upon the ramparts, overlooking the snowy wastes as if surveying his domain. Others insisted they saw Gendry perched there at his side, a silent lieutenant bound by chains of ice. The crowned stag banner was gone, replaced by no banner at all, just the stark emptiness of sky and stone, as though no living house would ever rule there again. Even if the living found a way to kill the Night King eventually, Storm's End would never be the same. The seat of House Baratheon, once a symbol of resilience, had been forever scarred by the touch of the dead. The proud roars of feasts in the great hall had fallen silent, replaced by the wind's mournful howl. The parapets that had rung with the footsteps of Robert Baratheon and his boisterous retinue were now haunted by the tread of wights. Where once the forging of steel for honorable battle filled the air, now an abominable cold craft turned out weapons of ice. Across Westeros, speculation grew about the final fate of House Baratheon. Some claimed that the line was extinct, that Gendry was the last of Robert's bastards legitimized and the only recognized heir. Now enthralled, he could not bear children, nor pass any claim to an heir. Others argued that House Baratheon's lineage might still survive through distant cousins or unacknowledged bastards in hidden corners of the realm. A few even clung to the desperate hope that Gendry could be freed from his undead imprisonment, though the nights grew longer and such hope dwindled with each passing day. As for the Night King, he had achieved a victory far more decisive than simply conquering another castle. By claiming Storm's End, he proved that no fortress in the Seven Kingdoms was beyond his reach. The future hung by a thread, precariously balanced between the living who still struggled to unite and the unstoppable tide of ice and death that spread outward from the Stormlands. The final war of the living and the dead was no longer confined to the north. It was upon every doorstep, from the arbor to the vale, from Dorne to the neck. And so, the dawn of an unending night loomed over Westeros. Storm's End stood as a grim testament to the Night King's power, its ramparts glittering white in the faint sun, banners tattered and gone, courtyard littered with silent wights. Gendry, once the hope of House Baratheon's renewal, stood among them, an embodiment of the kingdom's despair and the Night King's triumph. Thus did the storms of the south and the frozen nightmares of the north converge, forging a future that promised only cold and darkness, unless some unlikely hero or cosmic twist intervened to break the spell. Until that day, if it ever arrived, Storm's End and its turned lords remained a bastion of icy dread, a silent warning that in the great Game of Thrones, there were fates worse than death, and powers older and far more pitiless than any mortal king.